Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin.
The September heat still clung to Ashton Hills, Ohio, making the small dining room feel cramped despite the open windows. Rowan Whitmore adjusted the collar of her plain blue blouse and checked the time on her phone. 6:30. The birthday dinner was supposed to start at 6, but her mother always ran late when she wanted to make an entrance. Lorraine Whitmore's voice carried from the kitchen as she directed Mrs. Patterson from next door on where to set the appetizer plates. "Not there, Helen. The good china goes on the dining table. This is my birthday, not some backyard barbecue." Rowan stood near the mantel, studying the family photos that had remained unchanged for years. Her father, Richard, smiled back at her from a frame, his arm around a much younger Lorraine, who actually looked happy. That photo was taken 15 years ago, before the constant criticism and cutting remarks became Lorraine's preferred method of communication. "Rowan, come help me with the wine," her mother called. She walked into the kitchen where Lorraine was pulling bottles from the cabinet. At 58, Lorraine still moved with the sharp precision of someone who expected the world to bend to her will. Her dark hair was styled perfectly, her makeup applied with care, and her burgundy dress looked expensive, probably bought with money from their joint account. The red wine goes with dinner. The white stays chilled. Lorraine handed her daughter a bottle without looking at her. "Try not to drop it." "I won't drop it, Mom. You dropped that casserole dish last Christmas. Shattered all over my kitchen floor." Rowan had been helping clear the table after a long day of her mother's complaints about everything from the turkey being too dry to Rowan's sweater being too casual. That was an accident. Accidents happen when people don't pay attention. Lorraine finally looked at her daughter, her gray eyes scanning Rowan's outfit with obvious disapproval. "You couldn't have worn something nicer? This is a special occasion." "This blouse is nice." "It's plain. You always dress so plain. No wonder you can't keep a man interested." The familiar sting hit Rowan's chest, but she kept her expression neutral. 5 years of practice had taught her not to react. "I'll put the wine on the table." The dining room was filling up. The Hendersons from across the street chatted with the Pattersons, while Lorraine's sister Carol arranged flowers in a vase. Carol's husband, Mike, stood by the window, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Rowan recognized the look. It was the same expression her father used to get at these gatherings. "There's my beautiful daughter." Lorraine's voice projected across the room as she entered with a platter of appetizers. Several neighbors turned to smile at Rowan, but she caught the slight edge in her mother's tone. Beautiful was never a compliment when Lorraine said it. It was set up for something else. "Hi, everyone." Rowan managed a smile and moved toward the kitchen to help with the remaining dishes. "Oh no, you stay here," Lorraine said, placing a firm hand on her daughter's arm. "Helen and Carol can handle the rest. You should mingle with our guests." Mrs. Henderson approached with her husband trailing behind. "Rowan, dear, your mother tells us you're still working at that community center." "Yes, I am. I've been there 3 years now." "Such meaningful work," Mr. Henderson added. "Helping people must be very rewarding." Before Rowan could respond, Lorraine's voice cut through the conversation. "Rewarding, maybe. Profitable, not so much. I keep telling her she's wasting her education, but she insists on playing saint instead of finding a real career." The Hendersons exchanged an uncomfortable glance. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat. "Well, social work is certainly important." "Important doesn't pay the bills," Lorraine interrupted. "At 29, most women have figured out how to support themselves properly. But Rowan has always been different." Different. Another one of her mother's favorite words, always spoken with just enough emphasis to make it sound like a diagnosis. "Mom, maybe we should start dinner." Rowan suggested, hoping to redirect the conversation. "In a minute. I want to make a toast first." Lorraine moved to the sideboard and picked up her wine glass. "Everyone, could I have your attention?" The room quieted. Carol stopped arranging the flowers. The neighbors turned toward their hostess with expectant smiles. Mike checked his watch. Lorraine raised her glass, and for a moment, Rowan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe her mother would say something kind, something that would make all the years of criticism feel worth enduring. "Thank you all for being here on my 58th birthday," Lorraine began, her voice warm and gracious. "It means so much to have friends and family around me during this special time." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on Rowan. The warmth disappeared from her eyes. "You know, birthdays are about getting what you really want. And this year, I know exactly what would make me happiest." Lorraine's smile turned cold. "The best birthday gift? You leaving my life, Rowan. For good." The room went dead silent. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth. Carol dropped the flower she was holding. Mr. Henderson stared at his shoes. Rowan felt the words hit her like ice water, but she didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, her wine glass steady in her hand, and stared at her mother with an expressionless face. 5 years of practice had taught her this, too, how to absorb cruelty without giving Lorraine the satisfaction of a reaction. Mrs. Henderson let out a nervous laugh. "Oh, Lorraine, you're joking, right?" "Do I look like I'm joking?" Lorraine's voice remained bright and cheerful, as if she'd just commented on the weather. Carol stepped forward. "Lorraine, that's what?" Lorraine turned to her sister. "Honest? Yes, it is." Rowan set her wine glass down on the nearest table with deliberate care. She looked around the room at the faces staring back at her, some shocked, some embarrassed, some trying to pretend they hadn't heard what they'd clearly heard. Without saying a word, she walked past her mother, through the kitchen and out the back door. The September air felt cool against her burning cheeks as she crossed the yard to her car. Behind her, she could hear muffled voices through the dining room windows, her mother's laugh rising above concerned murmurs from the neighbors. Rowan got in her car and drove home to the small apartment she rented across town. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat on her couch in the gathering darkness and felt something cold and final settle in her chest. 58 years old. And her mother had just announced to a room full of people that her greatest birthday wish was for her only child to disappear. Find Rowan's apartment felt smaller in the darkness. She sat on her couch for an hour without turning on the lights, replaying her mother's words and the shocked faces around the dining room table. The humiliation wasn't new. Lorraine had been cutting her down in public for years. But this was different. This was deliberate cruelty performed for an audience. When she finally moved, it was to pull out her suitcases from the bedroom closet. She packed methodically, folding clothes and sorting through belongings with the same careful attention she brought to her work at the community center. As she filled the first suitcase, memories surfaced unbidden, not of tonight's dinner, but of all the other times her mother had found new ways to diminish her. The phone rang. Rowan glanced at the caller ID and saw Carol's name. She let it go to voicemail from her dresser drawer. She pulled out her father's leather journal. The brown cover was worn soft from years of handling, and the pages inside contained Richard Whitmore's thoughts during the last months of his life. He died of a heart attack 5 years ago, sudden and shocking, leaving Rowan alone with Lorraine's increasingly bitter cruelty. She held the journal against her chest for a moment, remembering how different her mother had been when Richard was alive. Not kind, exactly, but controlled, focused. After his death, all that focus had turned on Rowan like a laser designed to find and expose every flaw. "You're not woman enough to keep a man," Lorraine had said just 3 months ago when Rowan's relationship with David ended. They'd been standing in the grocery store checkout line, and Lorraine had made sure her voice carried to the customers behind them. 29 years old, and you drive them all away with that stubborn streak of yours. Rowan had wanted to explain that David had ended things because he'd gotten a job offer in Seattle and she wasn't ready to leave Ohio. But explaining to Lorraine was pointless. Her mother preferred her own version of events, especially when that version cast Rowan as a failure. "You dress like you've given up," had been another favorite criticism, usually delivered when they were around Lorraine's friends. "Plain clothes, plain hair, plain everything. No wonder you can't find a husband." The phone rang again. This time it was Mrs. Henderson. Rowan ignored it. She packed her father's journal carefully between two sweaters and continued filling the suitcase. As she worked, she thought about the house that should have been hers 5 years ago according to Richard's will, but which Lorraine had somehow convinced her to let her continue living in. "It's too big for you," her mother had said, "and I can't bear to leave all our memories." Rowan had been grieving and guilt-ridden and 24 years old. She'd agreed to let Lorraine stay in the family home while she moved to the apartment. She'd agreed to keep the joint bank accounts open so she could help with expenses. She'd agreed to a dozen arrangements that had seemed reasonable at the time but now felt like chains. Her phone buzzed with a text from Carol. "Rowan, please call me. That was inappropriate, and I'm sorry you had to hear it." Inappropriate, as if her mother had accidentally said something rude instead of deliberately humiliating her in front of 8 people. Another text, this one from Mrs. Patterson. "Honey, your mother doesn't mean it. She's just stressed about getting older." Rowan almost laughed. Stressed about getting older. As if that explained 5 years of systematic cruelty, she folded her work clothes, the simple blouses and slacks that Lorraine called plain, and thought about all the family gatherings where her mother had compared her to cousins who were married, or making more money, or living in bigger cities. "Rowan's still trying to find herself," Lorraine would say with a slight smile. "Some people just take longer to figure out what they're good at." The implication was always clear. Rowan wasn't good at anything. When David had been coming to family dinners, Lorraine had been different, nicer. She'd complimented Rowan's cooking and asked about her work with genuine interest. Rowan had started to hope that maybe they were finally building a better relationship. Then David left, and Lorraine's mask came off completely. "You should have been born a boy," she'd said just last month when Rowan had struggled to move a heavy bookshelf in her apartment. Lorraine had stopped by unannounced and found her daughter sweating and frustrated, trying to rearrange the living room furniture. "You've got no grace, no feminine charm. Men don't want to come home to someone who reminds them of their gym buddy." Rowan had wanted to point out that she was perfectly feminine, just not in the ways her mother valued. She was strong because her job required her to be strong. She was independent because life had taught her to be independent. She was direct in her communication because dancing around subjects was exhausting. But arguing with Lorraine was like arguing with a thunderstorm. The storm didn't care about your reasoning. Her phone rang a 3rd time. Lorraine. Rowan stared at the name on the screen and felt something harden in her chest. She could imagine the conversation. Her mother would claim she'd been joking, or that Rowan was being too sensitive, or that she'd had too much wine. There would be no apology, no acknowledgement of how devastating those words had been. She declined the call and continued packing. The truth was, tonight hadn't been a surprise. It had been the logical conclusion of 5 years of escalating cruelty. Lorraine had been building to this moment, testing how much humiliation Rowan would absorb before finally fighting back or walking away. Well, now she had her answer. Rowan pulled out her laptop and opened her banking app. The joint savings account showed a balance of $43,000 money she'd contributed steadily since starting her job at the community center. She'd been saving for a house down payment someday in the distant future when she could afford to buy something in a decent neighborhood. Someday had just become today. She transferred every dollar to her personal checking account. Then she opened a new browser window and searched for real estate lawyers in Cincinnati. Her cousin Avery lived there, and Cincinnati was far enough from Ashton Hills to feel like freedom.by midnight. She had appointments scheduled for the next week with both a lawyer and a real estate agent. The house her father had left her was worth almost $200,000 in the current market, more than enough to start over somewhere new. Her phone had stopped ringing, but the text messages continued. Carol was worried. Mrs. Henderson was concerned. Even Mike had sent a brief message. Your mom was out of line. Hope you're okay. But nothing from Lorraine. Rowan packed until 3 in the morning, then fell asleep on her couch, surrounded by boxes and suitcases. When she woke up 6 hours later, her first thought wasn't about her mother's cruel toast or the shocked faces of the neighbors. It was about how good it felt to finally have a plan. Rowan spent the next week moving through her life with surgical precision. She took vacation days from work and told her supervisor she was dealing with a family emergency. Technically, it wasn't a lie. The real estate agent, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh, met her at the family home on Tuesday morning while Lorraine was at her weekly hair appointment. The house looked smaller than Rowan remembered from her childhood, but Jennifer walked through the rooms with the enthusiasm of someone who saw potential. The bones are good, Jennifer said, running her hand along the oak banister. Hardwood floors throughout, updated kitchen, mature landscaping. In this market, you should have multiple offers within a week. I want to close as quickly as possible. Cash buyers can close in 2 weeks, if everything goes smoothly. Are you in a hurry for a particular reason? Rowan thought about explaining that she was essentially making her own mother homeless, but decided against it. I'm relocating for work. Jennifer nodded and pulled out her tablet. Let's talk about pricing strategy. They settled on a listing price that would generate interest, but leave room for negotiation. Jennifer promised to have the paperwork ready by Thursday and photos scheduled for Friday morning. What about your mother? Jennifer asked as they walked to their cars. Will she need time to find another place? She'll figure it out. On Wednesday, Rowan met with the lawyer her cousin Avery had recommended. Thomas Chun reviewed Richard's will and confirmed what she already knew. The house was hers, free and clear. Lorraine had no legal claim to it. Have you discussed this with your mother? He asked. Not yet. I'd recommend giving her written notice as soon as possible. 30 days is standard, but you can be more generous if you prefer. 30 days is fine. Thomas drafted the notice that afternoon. Rowan read it twice before signing, appreciating its cold legal language. There was no room for misinterpretation or emotional manipulation that on Thursday morning. She called a locksmith. She was waiting in her car when Lorraine returned from her sister Carol's house that afternoon. Her mother pulled into the driveway and sat in her car for a moment, probably wondering why there was a strange vehicle parked at the curb. Rowan got out and walked over as Lorraine emerged from the garage. What are you doing here? Lorraine's voice carried the same sharp edge it had held at the birthday dinner. I thought you were too good for family now. I brought you something. Rowan handed her the legal notice. Lorraine unfolded the paper and read it quickly. Her face went through several expressions: confusion, anger, disbelief before settling on cold fury. You can't be serious. The locks have been changed. You have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. This is my house. I've lived here for 22 years. Dad left it to me. You've been living here as my guest. Lorraine crumpled the paper in her fist. You ungrateful little. The joint accounts are closed too. You'll need to remove your belongings and find your own place. You can't do this. Rowan pulled the new house keys from her pocket and held them up. It's already done. I'm your mother. You're the woman who told a room full of people that your greatest birthday wish was for me to disappear from your life. Rowan's voice remained steady, conversational. Congratulations. You got what you wanted. Lorraine's face flushed red. I was upset. I didn't mean. Yes, you did. They stared at each other across the driveway. Rowan could see her mother calculating, trying to find the right combination of words that would undo the last 5 days. But there were no magic words. No explanation that could erase years of casual cruelty culminating in public humiliation. Where am I supposed to go? Lorraine's voice cracked slightly. That's not my problem anymore. Rowan walked back to her car without looking back. As she drove away, she could see Lorraine in her rearview mirror, standing alone in the driveway with the legal notice in her hand. By Friday afternoon, the house was listed. By Sunday evening, they had 3 offers. Rowan accepted the highest $115,000 over asking price from a young couple with a baby on the way. The closing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. She spent Monday morning at the community center, submitting her resignation letter and training her replacement on current cases. Her supervisor was sorry to see her go, but understood that family situations sometimes required difficult decisions. "You've been one of our best case workers," he said as she cleaned out her desk. "If you ever want to come back, there's always a place for you here." Rowan thanked him and meant it. The work had been fulfilling, even when her mother had dismissed it as meaningless. Helping families navigate crisis situations had taught her valuable skills she was now applying to her own life. On Tuesday, she loaded her car with the last of her belongings and drove to Cincinnati. Avery was waiting at her apartment with pizza and beer, and for the first time in a week, Rowan felt herself relax. "So you actually did it," Avery said as they sat on her couch eating dinner. "You actually made Aunt Lorraine homeless." She made herself homeless when she decided public humiliation was an appropriate birthday gift. "Mom told me what happened. She's pretty shaken up." Avery's mother was Carol, Lorraine's younger sister. Carol had always been the diplomatic one, trying to smooth over family conflicts and keep everyone talking to each other. "How's Mom taking it?" Rowan asked. "She's worried about both of you. She thinks this will blow over in a few months." "It won't." Avery studied her cousin's face. "You're really done with her." "I'm really done." They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Avery had always been easy to be around, funny and straightforward, with none of the complicated emotional landmines that characterized interactions with Lorraine. "Can I ask you something?" Avery said eventually. "Why now?" "I mean, she's been awful to you for years. What made this different?" Rowan considered the question. "She made it public, all those years of private cruelty, and then she announced to 8 people that she wanted me gone. She humiliated me in front of the neighbors, in front of Aunt Carol, in front of everyone. And you couldn't forgive that." "I couldn't pretend it didn't happen." The house closing went smoothly. Rowan signed the papers in the lawyer's office, while Lorraine was presumably packing her belongings into whatever temporary housing she'd managed to find. The young couple seemed thrilled to own their first home, and Rowan felt genuinely happy for them. Walking out of the lawyer's office with a check for nearly $200,000 felt surreal. 5 years ago, she'd been a broke college graduate living in her childhood bedroom and working part-time at a coffee shop. Now she had enough money to buy her own place, start her own life, and never depend on anyone else's goodwill again. That evening, she called the community center in Cincinnati where she'd applied for a job. They offered her a position starting the following Monday, better pay than her old job, and a chance to work with a more diverse population. Rowan's new life was taking shape exactly as she'd planned it. Her phone rang as she was getting ready for bed. Lorraine's name appeared on the screen. Rowan stared at it for a moment, then declined the call. Whatever her mother wanted to say, it was 5 years too late. She'd gotten her birthday wish. Now she could live with the consequences. Cincinnati felt like freedom. Rowan's new apartment was a converted loft in the Brewery District, with exposed brick walls and tall windows that let in more light than she'd seen in years. The neighborhood was full of young professionals, artists, and small businesses a world away from the suburban sameness of Ashton Hills. Avery lived 6 blocks away in a similar building, and they'd fallen into an easy routine of morning coffee runs and evening walks along the riverfront. It had been 3 weeks since Rowan left Ohio, and she was starting to understand what it felt like to live without the constant weight of her mother's disapproval. "You look different," Avery said as they sat in their favorite coffee shop on a Wednesday morning. "Lighter, somehow." Rowan stirred sugar into her latte and considered the observation. "I feel different, like I can breathe again." "Have you talked to her at all?" She's called 12 times. I haven't answered. What about Aunt Carol? She's called too, and texted. She wants me to work things out with Mom. Avery shook her head. Mom always thinks family problems can be solved with a good conversation and some hurt feelings. She forgets that some people are just toxic. Lorraine's not toxic. She's... Rowan searched for the right word. She's cruel. Deliberately, consistently cruel. Tell me something, Avery said, leaning forward. What's the worst thing she ever said to you? Before the birthday thing, I mean. Rowan didn't have to think about it. Last Christmas, we were at your mom's house, and everyone was opening presents. I gave Mom a scarf I'd picked out cashmere, expensive in her favorite color. She opened it and said, "How thoughtful. I'm sure some woman would love this." Then she set it aside and never mentioned it again. That's not so bad. She said it in front of everyone. Your mom, your dad, your brother Jake and his wife. The implication was clear. I wasn't woman enough to know what actual women wanted. Avery winced. Okay, that's pretty awful. That wasn't even the worst part. Later, when we were alone in the kitchen, she told me she was glad I was finally making an effort with gifts. But I should probably stick to gift cards in the future since I obviously didn't understand fashion or quality. She actually said that. She's been saying things like that for years. Little cuts, always delivered with just enough plausible deniability that I'd look oversensitive if I called her out. Avery was quiet for a moment. You know, I used to think you were exaggerating when you complained about her. I mean, she was always kind of sharp-tongued, but at family gatherings she seemed normal. She was different when Dad was alive, still critical but controlled. After he died, it was like she decided I was the perfect target for all her anger and disappointment. Why do you think that was? Rowan shrugged. Maybe she blamed me for not being the son she wanted. Maybe she was jealous that Dad and I were close. Maybe she just needed someone to punish, and I was convenient. They walked to work together, Avery to her job at a marketing firm, Rowan to the Northside Community Center, where she'd started the previous week. The work was similar to what she'd done in Ohio, but the clients were more diverse and the resources were better. She was helping a single mother navigate the housing assistance program when her phone buzzed with a text that IT was from a number she didn't recognize. "This is your Aunt Eunice. Carol gave me your number. Can we talk?" Rowan stared at the message in surprise. Eunice was Lorraine's older sister, but she'd been estranged from the family for years. Rowan hadn't seen her since she was a teenager. During her lunch break, she called the number. "Rowan? Thank God you called me back." Eunice's voice was warm but tired. "I heard about what happened." From Carol. From Carol. And then I heard Lorraine's version when she showed up at my door last night asking if she could stay here. Rowan's stomach tightened. "What did you tell her?" "I told her no. We haven't spoken in 8 years for good reason, and one family crisis doesn't erase that history." "Why haven't you spoken?" Eunice was quiet for a moment. "That's a long story. Are you free this weekend? I live about an hour north of Cincinnati. I think there are some things you should know about your mother and your father." Saturday morning, Rowan drove to the small town of Lebanon to meet the aunt she barely remembered. Eunice lived in a tidy farmhouse, surrounded by vegetable gardens and flower beds. She was older than Lorraine by 6 years, with gray hair and laugh lines that suggested she'd found ways to be happy that her younger sister had never discovered. "You look like your father," Eunice said as she poured coffee in her sunny kitchen. "Same eyes, same stubborn chin." "People always said I looked like Mom." "People see what they expect to see. Your mother wanted people to think you were hers through and through, but anyone who really knew Richard could see him in you." They sat at the kitchen table with coffee and homemade banana bread, and Eunice began to tell stories Rowan had never heard. "Your mother was always competitive," Eunice began. "Even as children, She couldn't stand for anyone else to be better at anything. When I got engaged first, she immediately started dating the richest boy in town. When I had my first baby, she spent months talking about how she was going to be the perfect mother. What happened when she married Dad? She tried to remake him. Richard was gentle, artistic, content with his job at the insurance company and his woodworking hobby. But that wasn't good enough for Lorraine. She wanted him to be ambitious, aggressive, successful in ways that would reflect well on her. Eunice pulled out a photo album and flipped to a page of wedding pictures. Richard looked young and happy, his arm around a radiant Lorraine who seemed genuinely joyful. She loved him at first, but love wasn't enough for your mother. She needed to win, to have the best husband, the most successful marriage, the most enviable life. When Richard didn't transform into her ideal man, she started trying to force the change. How? Constant criticism, suggestions that became demands, comparisons to other men who were doing better, earning more, achieving more. She would praise other husbands in front of him, talk about how wonderful it must be to be married to someone driven or ambitious. Rowan felt a familiar ache in her chest. She did the same thing to me. I know. Carol told me some of the things she said to you over the years. Eunice turned the page to photos of Richard holding baby Rowan. His face showed pure joy, the kind of happiness that couldn't be faked. When you were born, I thought things might get better. Richard was so happy to be a father, and Lorraine seemed proud of you at first. But as you got older, she started seeing you as another extension of herself that needed to be perfected. Is that why you stopped coming to family gatherings? Partly. But the real breaking point was 5 years ago, right after your father died. Eunice closed the album and looked directly at Rowan. Your mother called me the week after the funeral. She was upset that Richard had left the house to you instead of to her. She wanted me to help her convince you to sign it over. What did you tell her? I told her that Richard had good reasons for his decision, and she should respect his wishes. That's when she told me what she really thought. Eunice got up and walked to the window, looking out at her garden. She said Richard had been weak, that he'd never amounted to anything because he didn't have the strength to be a real man. She said he'd spoiled you by being too soft, and now she was going to have to toughen you up before you became as useless as he'd been. The words hit Rowan like a physical blow. She said Dad was useless. She said a lot of things that day. How disappointed she was in her marriage, how she'd wasted her best years on a man who never gave her the life she deserved, how she was going to make sure you didn't make the same mistakes. Rowan felt tears burning her eyes. Dad loved her, even when she was cruel to him. He never said a bad word about her. I know, and that's what she resented most. Richard's goodness made her look petty by comparison. Instead of trying to be better, she decided to tear him down. They sat in silence for a moment, Rowan processing this new understanding of her parents' marriage. After that phone call, I told Lorraine I didn't want to see her anymore, Eunice continued. I couldn't watch her destroy another person the way she'd destroyed Richard. When she showed up at my door last week, asking for help, I thought about how your father would have wanted me to respond. What did he want? He would have wanted me to protect you. That's what he was trying to do when he left you the house, give you the means to escape if you ever needed to. Rowan thought about her father's gentle hands teaching her to use woodworking tools in the garage, his patience when she struggled with math homework, his quiet pride when she graduated from college. She'd always known he loved her, but she'd never understood that he might have been trying to prepare her for a future without him. She's telling people I stole the house from her, Rowan said. Of course she is. Taking responsibility for her own actions has never been Lorraine's strong suit. Carol thinks I should forgive her. She thinks family is more important than whatever happened. Eunice shook her head. Carol means well, but she's never been on the receiving end of your mother's full attention. Lorraine saves her worst behavior for the people who can't easily escape husbands, children, anyone who depends on her. So you think I did the right thing? I think you did the only thing. Some people change when they're confronted with the consequences of their behavior. Others just get angrier and look for someone else to blame. As Rowan drove back to Cincinnati that evening, she felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Learning about her father's hidden struggles was painful, but understanding the full scope of her mother's cruelty somehow made her own decision feel more justified. She'd spent years wondering if she was too sensitive, too unforgiving, too quick to take offense. Now she understood that she'd been living with a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of psychological warfare. Her phone buzzed with another text from Lorraine. I hope you're proud of yourself. I'm staying in a motel because my own daughter threw me out of my home. Rowan deleted the message without responding. She was proud of herself. For the first time in years, she was proud of her own strength, her own judgment, her own ability to protect herself from someone who had never learned to love without causing pain. Her father would have been proud too. Back in Ashton Hills, Lorraine Whitmore sat in the cramped office of the Pinewood Extended Stay Motel, arguing with the manager about the weekly rate. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and old cigarettes, and the thin walls meant she could hear every conversation, television show, and argument from the neighboring units. This is temporary, she told the manager for the third time, just until I find something more suitable. The manager, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, nodded without much interest. That's what everyone says. Weekly rate is $420, due in advance. Lorraine handed over her credit card and tried not to think about how quickly her savings were disappearing. The joint account Rowan had emptied would have covered several months of decent housing. Now she was reduced to counting every dollar and sleeping on a mattress that felt like it had been stuffed with rocks. Her sister Carol had been sympathetic but unhelpful. You can stay with us for a few days, she'd offered, but Mike thinks you and Rowan need to work this out yourselves. A few days, as if 29 years of motherhood could be resolved with a long weekend of family mediation that Lorraine's friends had been more supportive, especially once she explained the situation properly. Helen Patterson had been outraged when she heard about the house. She can't just throw you out, Helen had said over coffee at the diner. There must be laws about that sort of thing. Apparently not when your own daughter wants to destroy your life. Margaret Henderson had been equally sympathetic. I always thought Rowan was a sweet girl, but this is just cruel. Making your own mother homeless? There's something wrong with someone who could do that. Lorraine had been careful in how she told the story. She mentioned the house, the closed bank accounts, the sudden abandonment, but she didn't mention the birthday toast. That part was harder to explain in a way that kept people's sympathy. She just snapped, Lorraine told anyone who would listen. One minute we were having a normal family dinner, the next minute she was storming out and refusing to take my calls. What set her off? Margaret had asked. Who knows? She's always been oversensitive. Richard spoiled her terribly, never made her face any real consequences for her behavior. Now I'm paying the price. The story got easier to tell with repetition. Rowan became increasingly unreasonable, increasingly cruel, increasingly incomprehensible in her motivations. Lorraine became the victim of a daughter's inexplicable cruelty, a mother betrayed by the child she'd sacrificed everything to raise. Some people bought it completely. Mrs. Thompson from the Church Ladies' Auxiliary had been horrified. After everything you've done for that girl, she'd said, shaking her head. All those years of support, all that love, and this is how she repays you. But others seemed less convinced. When Lorraine ran into Mike's brother at the grocery store, his response had been cooler. Sorry to hear about your troubles, he'd said politely. I'm sure it will work out. No outrage, no sympathy, no offers of help. Just empty politeness and a quick escape to the produce section. Lorraine was starting to realize that some people remembered her birthday dinner differently than she did. Carol, in particular, seemed to think the whole situation was more complicated than Lorraine was making it sound. "What exactly did you say to her that night?" Carol had asked during one of their phone conversations. Nothing that justified this reaction. She's always been dramatic. "Lorraine, I was there. You said something about wanting her to leave your life." "I was upset. People say things when they're upset. But you did say it." Lorraine had hung up on her sister rather than continue that particular conversation. The truth was, she did remember exactly what she'd said. She remembered the moment of satisfaction she'd felt seeing Rowan's face go blank with shock. She remembered the silence that followed, the uncomfortable shifting of the neighbors, the way Carol had looked at her with something like horror. But she also remembered years of frustration with a daughter who seemed determined to make all the wrong choices. Rowan had been such a promising child, smart, obedient, eager to please. Then she'd grown up and become stubborn, independent, unwilling to take advice or guidance. The social work job was a perfect example. Lorraine had tried to explain that helping poor people wasn't a career, it was charity work that happened to come with a paycheck. Rowan could have used her degree to get into business or law or medicine. Instead, she'd chosen to waste her intelligence on people who would never appreciate her efforts. "You're too good for that job," Lorraine had told her repeatedly. "You're selling yourself short." But Rowan had refused to listen, just like she'd refused to listen about her appearance, her dating choices, her living situation, or any of the other areas where her mother's guidance could have made a real difference. The birthday toast had been a moment of frustration boiling over. Lorraine had looked around her dining room at the neighbors and friends who seemed to think Rowan was wonderful, and she'd wanted them to understand what it was really like to have a daughter who rejected every piece of advice, ignored every suggestion, and seemed determined to waste her potential. She hadn't meant for it to sound as harsh as it did. She'd meant to be pointed, maybe a little cutting, but not devastating. The problem was that Rowan had no sense of humor about herself, no ability to laugh off criticism or brush aside comments that weren't meant to be taken literally. Richard had been the same way. Too sensitive, too ready to take offense, too quick to retreat into hurt feelings instead of engaging with the actual issues being raised. Lorraine's phone rang, interrupting her brooding. It was Carol again. "Have you heard from Rowan?" Carol asked without preamble. "No, she's still playing the victim." "Lorraine, she's not playing anything. She moved to Cincinnati, she got a new job, she's building a life for herself. That doesn't sound like victim behavior to me. She stole my house and my savings and disappeared in the middle of the night. What would you call it?" "I'd call it consequences." The word hit Lorraine like cold water. Consequences for what? For years of treating her like she wasn't good enough, for saying cruel things and then acting surprised when she finally had enough. "I never said cruel things. I tried to help her improve herself." "Lorraine, I love you, but you've been tearing that girl down since Richard died. Maybe before that, but I wasn't paying close enough attention." "That's not true. At Christmas last year, you criticized her outfit, her job, her cooking, and her decision to stay single, all in front of the family." She barely said 10 words the entire evening. Lorraine felt a flash of defensive anger. I was trying to motivate her to make better choices. By making her feel worthless. By helping her see that she could do better if she tried harder. That's not what it looked like from the outside. "Then maybe you should focus on your own family instead of judging mine." Carol was quiet for a long moment. "Eunice called me yesterday." "What did she want?" "She wanted to know if the stories Rowan told her were true, about the things you said about Richard after he died." Lorraine's heart started beating faster. "I never said anything about Richard that wasn't true. You told her he was weak. You told her he'd never amounted to anything. I was grieving. People say things when they're grieving. Do they? Because I grieved when Dad died, and I don't remember telling anyone he was worthless. Richard wasn't worthless. He was just limited. He never lived up to his potential. His potential for what? Making you feel important? Making other wives jealous? That's not fair. Neither was spending 20 years making him feel like he wasn't good enough for you. Lorraine hung up on her sister for the second time in a week. She sat in her motel room, surrounded by the belongings she'd been able to pack in her car, and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a respected member of her community, living in a comfortable home, surrounded by neighbors who valued her opinions and sought her advice. Now she was alone in a motel room, fielding awkward questions from people who seemed to think she'd somehow brought this disaster on herself. The worst part was the growing suspicion that some of them might be right. Her phone buzzed with a text from Helen Patterson. "Saw your house has sold already. The new owners seem nice. Young couple with a baby." Lorraine stared at the message and felt something break inside her chest. Strangers were living in the home she'd shared with Richard, sleeping in the bedroom where she'd spent 22 years, cooking in the kitchen where she'd raised her daughter. And Rowan had made it happen without a word of warning, without a moment of remorse, without any consideration for what it would mean to lose the last connection to the life they'd built together. Her daughter had erased her completely. Rowan spent Sunday afternoon in her new apartment, finally unpacking the last boxes from her move. Most of her belongings had found their places quickly, but she'd been avoiding one particular box, the one containing her father's personal effects. She'd packed his journal and a few other items when she'd cleaned out his desk 5 years ago, but grief had made it too painful to look through them carefully. Now, with the distance that came from time and her mother's absence, she felt ready to face whatever memories those belongings might contain. The box was smaller than she remembered. Inside, she found Richard's reading glasses, a few favorite pens, a small wooden box containing cufflinks and tie clips, and several notebooks. Some contained sketches for woodworking projects. Others had lists and reminders written in his neat handwriting, at the bottom of the box. She found something she didn't remember packing. A manila envelope with her name written on the front in her father's careful script. Rowan's hands shook slightly as she opened it. Inside were 4 letters, each one folded and dated. The earliest was from 2 years before his death. The latest was written just 3 months before his heart attack. She spread them out on her coffee table in chronological order, then picked up the first one. "My dear Rowan, I'm writing this letter hoping I'll never have to give it to you. But if you're reading it, then something has happened to me and you're dealing with your mother on your own. I need you to know that the tension between your mother and me isn't your fault, even though she might try to make you believe it is. Lorraine has always been a complicated woman, and her complications have gotten worse since we lost her parents, and she started feeling like life was passing her by. She loves you, but she doesn't know how to love without trying to control. She sees your independence as a rejection of her guidance, and she takes that personally. I've tried to shield you from the worst of it, but I won't always be here to run interference. You are exactly the person you should be. Don't let anyone, including your mother, convince you otherwise. Love always." Dad Rowan had to stop reading. Tears blurred her vision as she realized her father had known. He'd seen what was coming and tried to prepare her for it. The second letter was longer and more specific. "Rowan, your mother is angry with me again because I wouldn't push you to break up with David. She thinks he's not ambitious enough and that you're settling for less than you deserve. I tried to explain that what you deserve is to be happy, but she can't see past her own expectations. I'm worried about what will happen to you after I'm gone. Lorraine needs someone to focus her energy on, and without me as a buffer, that someone will be you. Please remember that her criticism isn't about your worth, it's about her fear that nothing in her life will ever be enough to make her happy. I've made arrangements to ensure you'll have options if you ever need them. The house will be yours, and there's a savings account in your name that Lorraine doesn't know about. Use them if you have to die. You're stronger than you know. Dad, the third letter was shorter, but more urgent. Rowan, last night your mother told me she thinks you're wasting your life and that I'm to blame for encouraging your unrealistic expectations. When I asked what she meant, She said, "I've made you think you're special when you're really just average, and that my coddling has prevented you from accepting that fact. I need you to understand something. You are special. Your kindness, your strength, your ability to see the best in people even when they disappoint you, these are gifts that make the world better. Don't let anyone dim that light in you. If something happens to me, don't feel obligated to take care of your mother at the expense of your own happiness. She's an adult who makes her own choices. You don't owe her a lifetime of penance for being yourself. Love." Dad, the final letter was the hardest to read. "My beautiful daughter, I had another fight with your mother today. She's frustrated that you chose social work over a real career, and she blames me for supporting your decision. She said some things about you that I won't repeat, but they were cruel and untrue. I'm starting to realize that I might not have protected you as well as I thought I did. Your mother's dissatisfaction with her own life has turned into a kind of poison, and she's been dripping it on both of us for years. I've absorbed most of it, but I can see her starting to focus more on you. Please know that every choice you've made has been right for you. Your work matters. Your independence is a strength, not a flaw. Your kindness is a gift, not a weakness. If anyone tells you otherwise, even your mother, they're wrong. I wish I could be there to remind you of this every day, but if you're reading this letter, then you'll have to remind yourself. Don't let her rewrite the story of who you are. I love you more than words can say. Dad Rowan sat in the silence of her apartment, holding the letters and crying for the father who had tried so hard to protect her, even beyond his own death. He'd known exactly what Lorraine would do once he was gone. He'd seen the cruelty building and tried to give his daughter the tools she'd need to survive it. The house, the secret savings account, the legal arrangements, they weren't just practical provisions. They were escape routes, carefully planned and quietly established by a man who understood that sometimes love meant helping someone leave. Her phone rang. It was Carol again. This time Rowan answered. "Rowan? Thank God. I've been trying to reach you for weeks." "I know. I needed some time to think. Your mother is staying in a motel. She's struggling, honey. Maybe it's time to—" "Aunt Carol, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did Dad ever tell you he was unhappy?" Carol was quiet for a moment. "Why do you ask?" "I found some letters he wrote before he died. He said things about Mom that I never knew he felt." "What kind of things?" Rowan looked down at the letters spread across her coffee table. That she was cruel to both of us, that he was trying to protect me from her, that he knew she'd get worse after he was gone. "Oh, sweetheart, did you know?" Carol sighed deeply. "I suspected. Richard was such a gentleman, and your mother could be demanding, but they seemed to find a balance. He wasn't balanced. He was drowning." "What do the letters say exactly?" Rowan read portions of them aloud, watching her aunt's perspective shift with each revelation. By the time she finished, Carol was crying. "I had no idea it was that bad," Carol whispered. "I thought they were just having normal marriage problems. He died of a heart attack at 53. Healthy men don't usually have heart attacks that young unless they're under enormous stress. Rowan, you can't blame your mother for your father's death." "I'm not blaming her for his death. I'm blaming her for making his life miserable, and then doing the same thing to me." Carol was quiet for a long time. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to live my life. The life Dad wanted me to have." "And your mother? What about her?" "She's still your mother. She's alone and struggling, and she's alone because she chose to humiliate her only child in front of 8 people. She's struggling because she never learned to take responsibility for her own choices. Don't you think she's learned her lesson?" Rowan looked at the letters again, at her father's careful handwriting documenting years of psychological abuse. "Some people don't learn lessons, Aunt Carol. They just find new people to blame." "So you're never going to forgive her?" "I'm never going to forget who she really is." After hanging up, Rowan carefully folded the letters and put them back in the envelope. She understood now why her father had written them, not just to explain his own suffering, but to validate hers. He'd known that Lorraine would try to rewrite history, to paint herself as the victim and Rowan as the ungrateful daughter. These letters were evidence. Proof that the cruelty had been real, systematic, and deliberate. Her mother had spent 5 years trying to convince Rowan that she was too sensitive, too demanding, too quick to take offense. But Richard's words confirmed what she'd always known deep down. She wasn't the problem. The cycle of cruelty that had consumed her father's happiness and nearly destroyed her own was finally broken. And she was never going back. The Maddox family reunion was held every other year at Eunice's farmhouse, a tradition that had continued even through the various feuds and estrangements that occasionally fractured the extended family. This year's gathering felt different to Rowan, as she helped Eunice arrange tables in the backyard. It was the first family event she'd attended since her father's funeral 5 years ago. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Eunice asked as they spread tablecloths on the picnic tables. "Carol invited her, you know." Rowan smoothed the corners of a red, checkered cloth and nodded. "I know. I told Carol it was fine." "It doesn't have to be fine. We could uninvite her." "No, it's time." Rowan had been in Cincinnati for 2 months now, and the distance had given her clarity. She'd found her footing in her new job, made friends among her neighbors, and started to understand what it felt like to live without constantly bracing for criticism. The scared, uncertain woman who had fled her mother's birthday dinner was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth. Avery emerged from the house, carrying a cooler full of drinks. "Mom just called. They'll be here in 20 minutes. Uncle Mike is driving, so he'll probably get lost and add another 10 minutes to that." "What about Lorraine?" Eunice asked. "She's riding with them." Rowan felt a familiar tightness in her chest but pushed it aside. She'd known this moment would come eventually. Better to face it on her own terms, surrounded by family, than to spend years looking over her shoulder. Cars started arriving at noon. Jake and his wife pulled up first, followed by Carol and Mike with Lorraine in the back seat. Rowan watched through the kitchen window as her mother emerged from the car, looking smaller and more frail than she remembered. "She's lost weight," Eunice observed, joining her at the window. "Good for her." Lorraine was wearing a dress Rowan didn't recognize, navy blue, with small flowers, conservative and unremarkable. Her hair was shorter than usual, and she moved with less of the confident authority that had always characterized her presence at family gatherings. "Rowan." Carol appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face tight with anxiety. "I'm so glad you came." "Thanks for organizing this, Aunt Carol." "I wasn't sure. I mean, with everything that's happened." "It's fine." "Really?" They hugged, and Rowan could feel her aunt's relief. Carol had always been the family peacekeeper, the one who worked tirelessly to keep everyone connected despite their differences. Having 2 sisters who refused to speak to each other, plus a niece caught in the middle, had been particularly hard on her. The first hour passed in carefully choreographed avoidance. Rowan helped serve lunch and caught up with cousins she hadn't seen in years, while Lorraine held court near the dessert table, accepting sympathy from relatives who had heard various versions of their estrangement. Rowan could hear fragments of her mother's conversations. "So difficult when children don't appreciate," and "after everything I sacrificed," and "some people just can't forgive." The familiar narrative was already taking shape. Lorraine was positioning herself as the wronged party, the mother whose ungrateful daughter had abandoned her in a moment of crisis. It was exactly what Rowan had expected. She was refilling the lemonade pitcher when Jake approached her. "Hey, cousin. Good to see you." "You too. How's the new house?" "Great. Kids love having a yard." He glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Listen, I don't know all the details about what happened with you and Aunt Lorraine, but Mom told me some things." "What kind of things?" "About your dad's letters. About how she treated both of you." Rowan set down the pitcher. And I wanted to say I'm sorry. We all knew she could be sharp-tongued, but we didn't know it was that bad. Why are you telling me this? Jake looked uncomfortable. Because she's been telling people you stole her house and abandoned her out of nowhere. Some of the relatives believe her version. Which relatives? The ones who don't know her very well. Uncle Frank and Aunt Susan mostly. They think you're being cruel. Rowan nodded. She'd expected this too. What do you think? I think if Dad had written letters like that about Mom, I'd have gotten him away from her years ago. Thanks. Are you going to tell people? About the letters? Rowan looked across the yard at her mother, who was deep in conversation with Susan and Frank. Lorraine's hands moved expressively as she spoke, and both listeners nodded sympathetically. I'm thinking about it. The moment came during dessert, when everyone had gathered around the picnic tables and conversation had settled into the comfortable rhythm of family stories and shared memories. Lorraine was in the middle of a story about Richard's woodworking projects when she made her mistake. He was so talented with his hands, she said, her voice carrying across the yard. I always told him he could have made a real business out of it if he'd had more ambition. But Richard was content to just make things for the house. He never wanted to push himself to achieve anything bigger. The words hung in the air, and Rowan felt something cold and final settle in her chest. Even here, even surrounded by family, even while grieving his absence, Lorraine couldn't resist diminishing Richard's memory. Rowan stood up. That's interesting, Mom, because I have some of Dad's writing from before he died, and he had different memories of his woodworking. Conversation stopped. All eyes turned to Rowan, who walked into the house and returned with the manila envelope containing her father's letters. Actually, he had different memories about a lot of things. Lorraine's face went pale. Rowan, this isn't the time. When is the time? When is it appropriate to tell the truth about what our family was really like? Carol started to stand. Maybe we should. Sit down, Aunt Carol. Everyone should hear this. Rowan opened the envelope and pulled out the first letter. This is from Dad, written 2 years before he died. She began to read aloud, her voice steady and clear. The words Richard had written in private, words about Lorraine's need to control, about her inability to love without criticizing, about his fear for Rowan's future, fell across the family, gathering like stones into still water. Rowan, stop. Lorraine's voice was sharp, but there was panic underneath it. This is the second letter. Rowan continued reading, sharing her father's observations about Lorraine's anger over David, about her criticism of Rowan's career choices, about her attempts to undermine his support for their daughter. Uncle Frank shifted uncomfortably. Aunt Susan stared at her plate. Jake's wife reached for his hand. And this is the last one he wrote. Rowan's voice broke slightly as she read Richard's words about Lorraine's cruelty, about his regrets over not protecting Rowan better, about his fear that his daughter would have to face her mother's poison alone. When she finished, the silence stretched across the yard like a held breath. Lorraine's face was flushed red. Those are private. You have no right. No right to what? To defend myself against your lies. I never lied about anything. You've been telling people I abandoned you out of nowhere, that I stole your house and disappeared without warning. You did steal my house. Rowan reached into the envelope again and pulled out a folded document. This is Dad's will. Should I read the relevant section aloud? That won't be necessary, Eunice said quietly. Good, because everyone here knows Dad left me that house 5 years ago, and I let you live in it rent-free because I felt sorry for you. Lorraine stood up, her chair scraping against the concrete patio. I don't have to listen to this. Yes, you do, because for once in your life, you're going to hear the truth about who you really are. Rowan, Carol said gently, maybe. She humiliated me in front of 8 people at her birthday dinner, Rowan continued, her voice rising. She told a room full of neighbors that her greatest birthday wish was for me to disappear from her life. After years of telling me I wasn't good enough, wasn't woman enough, wasn't successful enough, she decided to make her contempt public. She looked around the table at the faces staring back at her, some shocked, some sympathetic, some uncomfortable. Dad knew this would happen. He knew she'd try to destroy me the same way she destroyed him. That's why he wrote these letters. That's why he made sure I'd have options when I finally had enough. Lorraine's hands were shaking. Your father was weak. He never stood up for himself, never fought for anything he wanted. He just accepted whatever life gave him and complained about it in private. The words fell into the silence like a bomb. Jake's mouth fell open. Carol gasped. Even Uncle Frank, who had been nodding along with Lorraine's earlier complaints about Rowan, looked stunned. There it is, Rowan said softly. That's who she really is. Dad's been dead for 5 years, and she still can't resist tearing him down. Lorraine realized her mistake too late. She looked around the table at the family members who were now staring at her with varying degrees of horror and disgust. I didn't mean. Yes, you did. You meant every word. Just like you meant it when you told me your biggest birthday wish was for me to disappear. Lorraine's composure finally cracked. Fine. You want the truth? Here's the truth. You were never the daughter I wanted. You were stubborn and difficult, and you made choices that embarrassed me. Your father spoiled you and turned you against me, and now you act like you're too good for the woman who raised you. The silence that followed was deafening. Thank you, Rowan said calmly. That's exactly what I needed everyone to hear. Lorraine looked around the table at the faces staring back at her, finally understanding that she'd said too much. The family members who had been sympathetic to her plight just minutes earlier were now looking at her with expressions ranging from discomfort to outright disgust. I was upset, she said quickly, trying to backtrack. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. How did you mean it? Eunice asked, her voice cold. Rowan has always been difficult to deal with. She never listened to advice, never appreciated guidance. And after Richard died, she became even more stubborn. Guidance like telling her she wasn't woman enough to keep a man. Carol asked. Lorraine shot her sister a look of betrayal. You don't understand what it's like to watch your child make mistake after mistake and refuse to listen to reason. What mistakes? Jake's wife asked. Having a job that helps people? Choosing to be independent? She could have done so much more with her life. She had potential, and she wasted it on meaningless work that barely pays anything. Social work isn't meaningless, Avery said quietly. It's important. Important doesn't pay the rent. She was paying rent, Eunice pointed out. She was supporting herself and helping you maintain a house she owned. Lorraine's face flushed again. That house should have been mine. I lived there for 22 years. I made it a home. You what? Rowan interrupted. You lived there because Dad wanted you to have a place to live. But he left it to me because he knew you'd use it to control me if you could. That's not true. Rowan reached into the envelope one more time and pulled out another document. This is a copy of a conversation Dad had with his lawyer 6 months before he died. Should I read what he said about why he was leaving the house to me instead of you? Lorraine went very still. Where did you get that? The lawyer gave it to me when I met with him about selling the house. Apparently Dad was very specific about his reasoning. She unfolded the document and found the relevant section. Quote, I'm concerned about my wife's tendency to use financial leverage to control family members. I want to ensure my daughter has the independence to make her own choices about where and how to live. End quote. The silence stretched across the yard again. He also told the lawyer, and I quote, My wife has become increasingly critical and controlling since her parents died. I don't want my daughter to feel trapped in that relationship because of financial dependence. Uncle Frank cleared his throat. Well, that's pretty clear. Very clear. Eunice agreed that Lorraine's last attempt at maintaining her victim narrative crumbled visibly. I never tried to control anyone. I just wanted what was best for my family. What you wanted, Rowan corrected, was for Dad and me to become different people. People who would make you look good to your friends and neighbors. When we couldn't do that, you decided to punish us. I never punished anyone. You spent 5 years telling me I wasn't good enough. You criticized my job, my appearance, my relationships, my choices. You compared me to other people's children and found me lacking. You made sure I knew you were disappointed in who I'd become. I was trying to motivate you to improve yourself. By telling me I should have been born a boy, by announcing to a room full of people that you wished I would disappear from your life. Lorraine opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. She looked around the table at the family members who were no longer nodding sympathetically, no longer making excuses for her behavior. She stole my house, she said weakly, as if repetition might make the accusation true. She sold her house, Carol corrected. The house Dad left to her. I had nowhere to go. You had 2 months to find somewhere, Rowan said. I gave you 30 days notice, plus time to find a place. That's more consideration than you gave me when you humiliated me in front of your friends. You could have talked to me. You could have given me a chance to explain. Explain what? How telling 8 people that your greatest birthday wish was for your daughter to disappear was actually an expression of maternal love. Lorraine had no answer for that. Jake stood up. I think maybe it's time for us to head home. Other family members started gathering their belongings. The easy atmosphere of the reunion replaced by uncomfortable tension. As people said their goodbyes, the conversations were muted and awkward. Uncle Frank approached Rowan as she helped clear the tables. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. I believed her version of events. I thought you'd been cruel to your mother. You weren't the only one. Still, I should have known better. Lorraine's always been. He searched for the right word. Difficult. But I thought family was family, you know. Some family relationships are too toxic to maintain. I'm starting to understand that. Aunt Susan was less apologetic, but equally subdued. I suppose there are 2 sides to every story, she said as she gathered her purse. There are, Rowan agreed. The difference is one side has documentation. As the cars pulled away, Lorraine found herself standing alone by the dessert table, watching her family disperse with a new understanding of who she really was. The sympathetic audience she'd cultivated over the past 2 months was gone, replaced by people who had heard her cruelty in her own words. Carol approached her sister reluctantly. Lorraine, do you need a ride back to town? I suppose I do. They walked to the car in silence. As they drove back toward Ashton Hills, Carol finally spoke. You can't stay at the motel forever. I'm looking for an apartment. Are you going to try to talk to Rowan? Lorraine stared out the window at the familiar countryside. What would be the point? You heard what she thinks of me. I heard what you said about her. And about Richard. I was upset. You were honest. Maybe for the first time in years. They drove the rest of the way in silence. Both women lost in their own thoughts about how completely the family dynamic had shifted in the space of a single afternoon. 3 weeks later, Rowan hosted a dinner party in her Cincinnati loft. The guest list was small, but carefully chosen. Avery, Eunice, her new friend Maya from work, and Tom, a neighbor she'd been dating for the past month. The apartment looked warm and welcoming in the candlelight, with good food and wine arranged on the dining table she'd bought specifically for occasions like this. It was the first time in her adult life that she'd felt confident enough to open her home to people without worrying about criticism or judgment. This is amazing, Maya said, tasting the lasagna Rowan had spent the afternoon preparing. You didn't tell me you could cook. I've always liked cooking. I just haven't had much opportunity to do it for people. Why not? Rowan glanced at Eunice, who gave her an encouraging smile. My mother was very critical of my cooking. and everything else. It was easier not to try than to deal with the criticism. "Well, her loss is our gain," Tom said, raising his wine glass. "This is restaurant quality." The conversation flowed easily around the table: work stories, weekend plans, funny anecdotes about city life. Rowan found herself laughing more than she had in years, enjoying the simple pleasure of being around people who liked her exactly as she was. "Can I ask you something?" Maya said during dessert. "You seem so confident and put together, but you talk about yourself like you're still learning how to do basic things. What's that about?" Rowan considered how to answer. Maya knew the broad outline of her story: the move from Ohio, the estrangement from her mother, but not the details. "I spent a lot of years being told I wasn't good enough," she said finally. "It takes time to unlearn that kind of conditioning." "Who told you that?" "Someone who was supposed to love me unconditionally." Maya's expression softened. "That's awful. I'm sorry." "It's okay. I'm learning to trust my own judgment instead of depending on other people's approval." Eunice reached over and squeezed her hand. "Your father would be so proud of you." "I think so too." As the evening wound down and the guests prepared to leave, Avery pulled Rowan aside in the kitchen. "Have you heard anything from Aunt Lorraine since the reunion?" "Nothing direct. Carol told me she found an apartment near the mall. 1 bedroom, apparently." "How do you feel about that?" Rowan considered the question. Relieved, mostly, and maybe a little sad. Sad for her. Sad for what could have been different if she'd been capable of loving people without trying to change them. "Do you ever think about reaching out?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. She had 30 years to learn how to be a mother. She chose cruelty instead. What if she apologized? Really apologized? Not just said, "She was sorry you were upset." Rowan thought about her father's letters, about 5 years of systematic psychological abuse, about the birthday toast that had finally broken her tolerance for Lorraine's cruelty. "Some things can't be fixed with apologies, Avery, and some people never change, no matter how many chances you give them." After everyone left, Rowan poured herself another glass of wine and sat on her couch, looking around at her new life. The apartment was quiet, but not lonely, filled with the remnants of an evening spent with people who cared about her happiness. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Thanks for a wonderful evening. Your friends are great, and you're an amazing cook. Can't wait to see you this weekend." She smiled and texted back, "Thanks for coming. See you Saturday." A year ago, she would have analyzed every word of his message, looking for hidden criticism or signs of dissatisfaction. Now she could simply accept that he'd enjoyed himself and was looking forward to seeing her again. Another text, this one from Maya. "Seriously, best lasagna ever. And I love your new place. You should host dinner parties every month." The idea appealed to her. Regular gatherings with friends, good food, easy conversation, no walking on eggshells or bracing for criticism. It was a kind of life she'd never imagined possible. Rowan raised her wine glass to the empty room. "To Lorraine Whitmore," she said aloud. "She wanted me gone. She got her wish. But she'll live the rest of her life knowing she lost everything else, too." The words felt final, like the closing of a door that had been hanging open for too long. There would be no reconciliation, no forgiveness, no tearful reunion where they worked through their differences and learned to love each other properly. Some stories didn't have happy endings. Some relationships were too damaged to repair. Some people chose cruelty over love so consistently that they forfeited their right to second chances. Rowan had accepted all of that, and in accepting it, she had found freedom. She finished her wine and went to bed in her new apartment in her new city, surrounded by the life she had built for herself. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without thinking about her mother at all. 6 months later, Carol called with news that Lorraine had suffered a minor heart attack and was asking for her. Rowan listened politely, expressed appropriate concern for her mother's health, and declined to visit. "She's alone," Carol said. "She doesn't have anyone else." "She has you. She has Jake. She has the neighbors who believed her story about me. It's not the same as having your daughter. She should have thought of that before she spent 5 years trying to destroy me. People change, Rowan. Near-death experiences can be transformative. Some people change. Others just get better at manipulation when their old methods stop working. Don't you think you owe her? I don't owe her anything, Rowan interrupted gently. I gave her 30 years of chances to be a decent mother. She used every one of them to tear me down instead of building me up. So that's it? You're never going to see her again. That's it. Carol was quiet for a moment. I think you're making a mistake. I think I'm finally making the right choice. A year later, Rowan received another call from Carol. Lorraine had died in her sleep, alone in her small apartment. The funeral would be small, just immediate family and a few neighbors. Rowan sent flowers but didn't attend the service. She was in Cincinnati, living the life her father had wanted for her, surrounded by people who loved her exactly as she was. It was exactly where she belonged.